Welcome. Settle in. Get comfortable. Let your breathing slow. Close your eyes gently. And let me tell you the story of a man who had absolutely everything and lost it all in a single moment, and then discovered that losing everything was exactly what he needed to find his true purpose. The story of Dr. Stephen Vincent Strange, who became the Sorcerer Supreme, the master of the mystic arts, the defender of reality itself. And this is a tale about ego and humility, about control and surrender, about a brilliant surgeon who thought his hands and his mind made him special, learning that true power comes not from what you can do, but from what you choose to do with your abilities. So let's begin in New York City, in Manhattan, in one of the most prestigious hospitals in the world, where the best doctors practiced medicine at the highest level, where impossible surgeries were performed daily, where lives were saved through skill and dedication and the absolute cutting edge of medical science. And in this hospital, there was a neurosurgeon, and his name was Stephen Strange, and he was without question the most talented surgeon in the entire world. The doctor that other doctors called when a case was completely impossible, when a patient had a brain tumor wrapped around crucial nerves that no one else would touch, when someone needed surgery so delicate that a single tremor, a single mistake would mean death or permanent disability. And Stephen Strange had hands that never trembled, had a mind that could visualize neural pathways in 3 dimensions, could plan surgeries that seemed impossible and execute them perfectly. And he knew exactly how good he was, and his ego was proportional to his talent, which meant it was absolutely massive, larger than life, insufferable to everyone who had to work with him. And he was cruel in the casual way that brilliant people sometimes are when they've never been truly humbled, when they've never faced something their gifts couldn't overcome. Stephen Strange lived in a beautiful penthouse apartment overlooking the city, filled with expensive artwork and rare antiques and all the trappings of wealth. And he drove expensive cars, wore expensive watches that cost more than most people made in a year, dated beautiful people and discarded them when they bored him, gave lectures where he showed off and humiliated other doctors by pointing out their mistakes in front of audiences, and he was fundamentally alone despite being constantly surrounded by people, isolated by his enormous ego and his belief that he was simply better than everyone around him. Smarter, more skilled, more important, and the only person who truly saw through this facade, who understood that beneath all the arrogance was a deeply insecure man, terrified of being ordinary, terrified of failure, was Christine Palmer, a fellow surgeon who worked in emergency medicine at the same hospital. And Christine had dated Stephen once, years ago, had seen past his brilliance to the wounded person underneath, but she'd eventually walked away because Stephen couldn't commit to anyone, couldn't open himself up, couldn't be vulnerable, could only be the brilliant Dr. Strange performing for an audience, and Christine remained his friend, somehow, remained someone who would call him on his behavior, who would show up at his apartment with takeout food and make him eat something other than the expensive catered meals he usually had, who represented everything Stephen could have been if he'd learned earlier that being a doctor was about helping people, not proving how clever you were. But Stephen couldn't see this, couldn't understand what Christine was trying to teach him through her example, was too wrapped up in his own ego, too invested in being the best. And this blindness, this inability to see what really mattered, would cost him everything before he finally learned the lessons that had been in front of him all along. Stephen's life was built entirely on control, on his absolute certainty that through skill and knowledge and relentless discipline, he could master anything, solve any problem, overcome any obstacle. And this belief had served him well, had taken him from medical school to the top of his field, had made him wealthy and famous and respected, at least professionally, if not personally, and he'd built his entire identity on this foundation of control and achievement. On being Dr. Stephen Strange, the neurosurgeon who could do impossible things, and he chose the most difficult cases not because he wanted to help the patients, though he told himself that's why he did it, but because he wanted to prove he could do what no one else could do, wanted another impossible surgery for his record, another testament to his genius, another story he could tell at conferences and lectures, and he was invited everywhere, asked to speak at medical schools and hospitals around the world, and he would show up and dazzle audiences with tales of impossible surgeries while simultaneously making other doctors feel inadequate, making them understand that they would never be as good as Stephen Strange. And people hated him for this arrogance, even as they respected his skills. And Stephen didn't care whether people liked him, because being liked wasn't the point. Being the best was the point. Being right was the point. Having everyone acknowledge his superiority was the point. And this worked for him for years. This life of achievement without real human connection, of success without deeper meaning or purpose. And he thought he had everything figured out, thought he understood what life was about and what mattered. And then on one rainy night, everything changed. Everything fell apart. And Stephen Strange learned that all his control was an illusion, that the universe could take away everything he valued in a single instant, and there was nothing his brilliant mind or his skilled hands could do to stop it. The accident happened on a Tuesday evening. Stephen had just finished a complicated surgery, had saved a patient everyone else said was unsavable, and he was driving to a speaking engagement, speeding through rainy streets because he was running late. And Stephen Strange didn't do late, didn't accept that traffic or weather could make him fail to meet a commitment. And he was on his phone looking at x-rays that a colleague had sent him, reviewing another impossible case, offering his opinion while driving 70 miles an hour in a 45 zone. And he was texting and looking at medical images and only occasionally glancing at the road. And his car, this expensive sports car that he'd bought because it was fast and beautiful and proved he'd made it, hydroplaned on the wet pavement, and Stephen tried to correct, but he overcorrected, and the car went off the road, tumbled down an embankment, rolled multiple times, and Stephen's hands, his perfect surgeon's hands that had never trembled, that had performed miracles, were crushed against the steering wheel, bones shattered, nerves severed. And when the car finally stopped rolling and Stephen was hanging upside down in the wreckage, he couldn't feel his hands, couldn't move his fingers. And when the paramedics arrived and extracted him from the destroyed vehicle, when they rushed him to the hospital where he worked, where his colleagues operated on him, he woke up to discover that his hands were destroyed, 11 pins in his left hand alone, nerve damage that might be permanent, and the doctors, his colleagues and competitors, told him that he'd never operate again, that the damage was too severe, that he should be grateful he was alive and start thinking about what else he could do with his medical degree, teaching or consulting or research. And Stephen didn't believe them, refused to believe them, because operating was who he was. Surgery defined him. Without his ability to cut and repair and save lives with his hands, he was nothing, or so he thought. And this belief, This identification of his entire self-worth with his surgical skills would drive him to the edge of madness and beyond, would drain his fortune and destroy his relationships, and ultimately lead him to a doorway in Kathmandu where everything he thought he knew about reality would be shattered. Stephen's obsession with fixing his hands consumed him completely. He spent his entire fortune on experimental surgeries and treatments, tried everything that conventional medicine could offer, saw doctors around the world, underwent painful experimental procedures, and nothing worked. His hands still shook, still couldn't hold a scalpel steady, still betrayed him every time he tried to do the fine motor control that neurosurgery required. And he watched his bank accounts drain, watched his savings disappear, watched his expensive apartment get sold to pay for treatments, watched his whole life collapse while his hands remained broken, and he blamed everyone, raged at the doctors who couldn't fix him, screamed at Christine when she tried to help him, pushed away everyone who cared about him, and he became bitter and angry and completely consumed by his need to get his old life back, to return to being Dr. Strange, the brilliant surgeon. And he couldn't accept that maybe this loss was permanent. Maybe he needed to find a new purpose. Maybe being a surgeon wasn't the only valuable thing he could do with his life. And Christine tried to tell him this, tried to suggest that he could still help people, could teach medical students or do research or consult on difficult cases, could use his brilliant mind even if his hands were damaged. But Stephen rejected all of this because it wasn't enough, wasn't what he wanted. He wanted surgery, wanted the operating room, wanted the feeling of saving a life through the skill of his hands. And he couldn't let go of this need, couldn't move forward, was stuck in grief and rage and desperation. And he had almost given up, had almost accepted that there was no hope, when someone told him about Jonathan Pangborn. Jonathan Pangborn had been a patient Stephen had refused years ago, a paraplegic with a complete spinal injury that Stephen deemed not worth his time because the case wasn't interesting enough, wasn't challenging enough, didn't offer Stephen anything in terms of advancing his reputation, and Stephen had dismissed Pangborn coldly, told him to find another doctor, never thinking about this man again. But now Pangborn sought out Stephen, found him in the physical therapy clinic where Stephen was struggling to regain even basic hand function, and Pangborn walked into the clinic, walked on legs that should never have worked again. And Stephen was shocked, demanded to know how this was possible, how someone with a C7-C8 spinal injury could be walking, and Pangborn told him about Kamartaj, about a place in Kathmandu where he'd been healed through means that Western medicine couldn't explain, through techniques that sounded like mysticism and magic. And Stephen, who believed only in science, who had spent his entire life studying the body as a biological machine, dismissed this as nonsense, as charlatan tricks. But Pangborn just smiled and said that Stephen could believe what he wanted, could stay stuck in his rationalist worldview and remain broken, or he could open his mind to possibilities beyond what medical school had taught him. And Pangborn walked away, and Stephen was left with a choice: stay in New York, accepting that he would never operate again, or spend the last of his money on a desperate journey to Nepal, chasing what was probably a con. And Stephen, having nothing left to lose, chose to go, chose to take this last desperate chance, and he used his final savings to buy a plane ticket to Kathmandu. And he travelled across the world, seeking Kamartaj, seeking this miracle cure, never imagining that what he would find would shatter his entire understanding of reality, would transform him from a surgeon who fixed bodies into a sorcerer who defended the fabric of existence itself. Finding Kamataj was not easy. Stephen wandered the streets of Kathmandu for days, asking about mystics and healing, getting laughed at by locals who thought he was another Western tourist looking for enlightenment, getting scammed by con artists who promised miracles for money. And Stephen was running out of funds, running out of time, sleeping in cheap hostels, eating cheap food, and his expensive clothes got dirty and torn, and he looked less like a famous surgeon and more like a desperate beggar. And one night he was mugged in an alley, attacked by men who wanted the little money he had left, and Stephen tried to fight back, but his damaged hands made him helpless, and he was being beaten, was probably going to die in this alley in Kathmandu, when someone intervened, a tall man in unusual clothing who fought off the attackers with a wooden staff, moving with impossible speed and precision. And this man was Carl Mordo. And Mordo looked at Stephen lying in the alley and saw something, saw potential or desperation, or perhaps just pity. And Mordo helped Stephen to his feet and asked what he was seeking. And Stephen, broken and desperate, said he was looking for Kamataj, looking for healing. And Mordo studied him for a long moment and then said, "Follow me." And he led Stephen through winding streets to an old building with an ornate door. And Mordo knocked in a specific pattern, and the door opened, and Stephen entered into a courtyard that seemed impossible, seemed larger inside than the building could contain, filled with people in robes practicing movements that looked like martial arts, but somehow more than that. And Mordo brought Stephen before the Ancient One, the leader of this place, the master of whatever they practiced here. And Stephen expected an old Asian man like the mystics in movies, but the Ancient One was a woman, was bald and ageless, wearing simple robes, and she looked at Stephen with eyes that seemed to see through him, seemed to understand everything about him instantly. And Stephen, falling back on his arrogance because it was all he had left, demanded that she heal him, demanded the treatment he'd come for. And the Ancient One smiled slightly and asked him what he truly sought. And Stephen said his hands, said he wanted to be able to operate again. And the Ancient One said that Kamataj was not a medical facility, that what they did here was not about healing bodies, but about expanding consciousness and defending reality. And Stephen, frustrated and angry, called this mystical nonsense, said there was no scientific basis for anything she was claiming, and the Ancient One, still smiling, asked him if he wanted to see the truth. And before Stephen could answer, she reached forward and touched his forehead, and everything changed. The Ancient One pushed Stephen's astral form out of his physical body, separated his consciousness from his flesh, and Stephen saw himself standing there, saw his own body from outside, and his rational mind screamed that this was impossible, that consciousness couldn't exist separate from the brain, but he was experiencing it, was floating outside his body. And then the Ancient One pushed him further, sent his consciousness flying through dimensions, through the multiverse, and Stephen saw infinite realities folding over each other, saw impossible geometries and colors that didn't exist in normal space, saw beings of pure energy and dimensions where physics worked differently, saw the fundamental structure of reality itself, the quantum foam that underlies existence. And his mind, his brilliant rational mind, tried to process this, tried to fit it into his understanding of science, and couldn't, there was no way to reconcile what he was experiencing with everything he thought he knew about the universe. And the Ancient One showed him sorcerers drawing power from other dimensions, showed him people creating portals through space with hand gestures, showed him magic being used to defend Earth from threats that existed beyond normal reality, showed him that everything he thought was real was just the surface layer, that beneath and beyond and within the physical world was something stranger and more wonderful than he'd ever imagined. And then she brought him back, returned his consciousness to his body, and Stephen collapsed, gasping, and the Ancient One asked if he believed now, and Stephen, his worldview shattered, his understanding of reality destroyed and rebuilt in minutes, could only nod, and he begged her to teach him. And she studied him carefully, saw his arrogance and his desperation and his potential, and she decided to give him a chance. Decided to see if Stephen Strange could learn to be something other than an arrogant surgeon, could learn humility and surrender and service, and she accepted him as a student. And Stephen's training in the mystic arts began, and nothing would ever be the same. Training at Kamatage was the most humbling experience of Stephen's life, because he was used to being the best at everything, used to mastering new skills quickly through intelligence and dedication. But magic didn't work like surgery, couldn't be learned through study alone, required something Stephen didn't have, required belief and spiritual openness and a willingness to surrender control. And while other students created sparks and shields and simple spells, Stephen couldn't do anything, couldn't create even the most basic magic. And this failure was destroying him, was attacking the core of his identity, because he'd always been special, always been the smartest person in the room. And here at Kamatage, he was behind everyone, was the worst student, couldn't make magic work no matter how hard he tried, and he studied obsessively, read every book in the library, memorized incantations and hand movements, understood the theory perfectly. But theory meant nothing when he couldn't execute, when his hands moved through the gestures and nothing happened. No spark, no portal, no magic, and Mordo tried to help him, tried to explain that magic required drawing energy from other dimensions, required will and visualization and belief, and Stephen understood intellectually but couldn't make it work, and he was failing, was facing the very real possibility that he'd given up everything, spent his last money to come here, and he wasn't special after all, wasn't capable of mastering this the way he'd mastered surgery. And this realization, this confrontation with his own limitations, was exactly what Stephen needed, was the humbling that would eventually make him truly powerful. But in the moment it just felt like more loss, like more failure. The turning point came when Stephen stopped trying to control magic and started trying to understand it on its own terms. When he approached it not as a surgeon executing a procedure, but as a student genuinely trying to learn something completely new, when he let go of his need to be the best and just focused on connecting with the energy around him, and late one night, frustrated and exhausted and on the edge of giving up, Stephen tried one more time to create a portal. And this time he didn't think about technique or try to force it to work. He just visualized where he wanted to go, visualized a portal opening, and trusted that the energy would respond, and sparks appeared around his hands, golden light forming a circle, and the circle became a portal, unstable and flickering but real, and Stephen stared at what he'd created. stared at this impossible thing, this gateway through space that violated every law of physics he'd ever learned. And he felt something he hadn't felt since before the accident. He felt wonder, genuine awe at something beautiful and impossible. And from that moment, his learning accelerated. He could create portals and shields, could draw on energy from the dark dimension and shape it into constructs. And he threw himself into studying the mystic arts with the same obsessive dedication he'd once applied to medicine. But this time it was different. This time he wasn't just trying to prove he was the best. He was genuinely fascinated, genuinely curious about this new understanding of reality. And he learned about the Infinity Stones, these 6 objects of immense power that controlled fundamental aspects of existence. And he learned that one of them, the Time Stone, was kept at Kamartaj in an artifact called the Eye of Agamotto, and the Ancient One warned all her students never to use it, that manipulating time was incredibly dangerous, could create paradoxes and destroy reality. But Stephen, being Stephen, couldn't resist, couldn't leave alone something so powerful and interesting, and he used the Time Stone in secret, used it to study faster, created time loops where he could read entire libraries in what seemed like hours, and Wang, the librarian and master sorcerer, caught him and was furious, explained all the terrible things that could happen when you manipulated time, how you could erase yourself from existence or create paradoxes that destroyed everything. And Stephen understood the danger intellectually, but still believed deep down that his brilliance would let him avoid the consequences that trapped everyone else, still had enough of his old arrogance to think he was special, and this arrogance would eventually lead to both his greatest triumph and his greatest mistake. The Ancient One was dying, had been dying for a long time, had used forbidden magic to extend her life for centuries, drawing power from the dark dimension the same way her enemy Caecilius did. And this hypocrisy, this gap between what she preached and what she practiced, would eventually drive Mordo away from Kamataj. But for now, the Ancient One kept this secret, kept drawing on dark energy to stay alive because she'd seen the future Yusen. G, the Time Stone, had looked forward through countless timelines and seen threats coming that would require her students to be ready, and she pushed Stephen harder than the other students, gave him access to forbidden knowledge, forced him to grow faster because she'd seen that Stephen Strange would be crucial to Earth's future, would face threats she couldn't, would make choices that would save or doom reality, and she was preparing him as fast as she could, knowing her time was running short. And when Caecilius, her former student who turned to dark magic seeking power and immortality, attacked Kamartaj and stole pages from the Book of Cagliostro, forbidden texts about summoning Dormammu from the dark dimension, the Ancient One knew the endgame was beginning, knew that her death was approaching, and Stephen would have to be ready, and she sent Stephen and Mordo to stop Caecilius, threw Stephen into real magical combat before he was truly ready, because there was no more time for training. The threat was here, and Stephen had to face it, ready or not. The fight with Caecilius and his zealots was brutal and terrifying. They could manipulate reality itself, could make buildings fold and twist, could turn the mirror dimension into a kaleidoscope of impossible geometry, and Stephen was out of his depth, was barely surviving, using every trick he'd learned and inventing new ones desperately. And Caecilius explained his plan, that he would summon Dormammu, this entity of pure power, from the dark dimension, and Dormammu would absorb Earth into his dimension where time didn't exist. where everyone would live forever. And Caecilius believed this was salvation, believed death was humanity's curse, and Dormammu would free them, and the Ancient One tried to stop him, fought magnificently using centuries of skill and knowledge. But Caecilius' zealots managed to land a fatal blow, and the Ancient One was dying, and they brought her to Metro General Hospital, the same hospital where Stephen had worked, where Christine Palmer still worked, and Christine operated on the Ancient One while Stephen stood in astral form watching, unable to help, and the Ancient One's astral form appeared beside Stephen. And they talked, and she confessed that she'd been drawing power from the dark dimension herself, had been using the same forbidden magic she'd forbidden her students from using. And Stephen felt betrayed, asked how she could preach rules she didn't follow, and the Ancient One explained that she'd never claimed to be perfect, that sometimes doing the right thing required moral compromise, required using questionable means for good ends, and she told Stephen that he would face the same choice, that being Sorcerer Supreme meant making impossible decisions with no good options, and she told him that she'd used the Time Stone to look at countless futures, had seen her own death approach in all of them, and she'd accepted it, had made peace with it, and she told Stephen that death gave life meaning, that without mortality nothing would matter, and she faded away, her astral form disappearing as her body died. And Stephen had lost another mentor, another person who believed in him, and he was terrified because he didn't know if he could do what she'd done, didn't know if he was ready to protect the world from something as powerful as Dormammu. But he didn't have a choice. The threat was here. Caecilius was coming, and Stephen Strange would have to face him, ready or not, and the fate of the entire Earth hung in the balance. Stephen Strange stood at the New York Sanctum, one of 3 buildings scattered across the globe that protected Earth from mystical threats, and these sanctums formed a shield that kept malevolent entities from other dimensions from entering our reality. And if all 3 sanctums fell, then Earth would be defenseless, would be vulnerable to beings like Dormammu who wanted to absorb our dimension into their own. And Caecilius knew this, understood that destroying the sanctums was the key to bringing Dormammu to Earth, and he attacked the New York Sanctum with his zealots, and Stephen fought alongside Wong and the few remaining masters who guarded the building, and the battle was desperate and chaotic, reality itself bending and twisting as Caecilius used his mastery of dimensional manipulation to turn the sanctum into a weapon, making walls move and floors shift and gravity reverse. And Stephen had to use everything he'd learned, had to be creative and resourceful, had to think like a surgeon planning an operation, but also like a sorcerer embracing the impossible. And he discovered he had a talent for combat magic, for using his environment strategically, for thinking several moves ahead the way he'd once planned complicated surgeries. And he wielded the crimson bands of Sitarak to restrain enemies, created shields to deflect attacks, opened portals to redirect Caecilius' strikes back at him, and he was holding his own, was proving that despite being a relatively new sorcerer, he could fight at the highest level. But Caecilius was more experienced, more powerful, had spent wide 2 years mastering dark magic. And he was winning, was overwhelming the defenders, and he managed to destroy the New York Sanctum, and then he went to Hong Kong where the final sanctum stood, and by the time Stephen and Wong arrived, Caecilius had already succeeded, had already destroyed the Hong Kong Sanctum, and Dormammu was coming, was beginning to absorb Earth into the dark dimension, and people were dying, being transformed into energy as the dimensions merged, and Stephen tried to use the time stone to reverse the destruction, tried to undo what Caecilius had done. But Caecilius and his zealots existed outside time now, protected by Dormammu's power, and Stephen couldn't reverse their actions, couldn't save the day with clever magic, and he realized that the only way to stop Dormammu was to confront the entity directly, to go into the dark dimension and somehow convince or force this being of infinite power to leave Earth alone, and it was a suicide mission, was absolutely impossible. But Stephen had learned something during his time at Kamar-Taj, had learned that sometimes the right thing to do was also the impossible thing, that heroes were defined not by their powers, but by their willingness to sacrifice. And he'd watched the Ancient One die protecting Earth, had seen her accept her death with grace, and he understood now that this was what being Sorcerer Supreme meant, being willing to give everything to protect others. So Stephen Strange opened a portal to the dark dimension, flew through into Dormammu's realm, and prepared to face a god. The dark dimension was unleashed. Anything Stephen had experienced was a realm without time, where Dormammu existed as a being of pure energy, vast and terrible, a face made of flame and darkness that filled the sky, and Stephen floated before this entity that could destroy him with a thought, and he made his offer, said, "Dormammu, I've come to bargain," and Dormammu, amused by this tiny human's audacity, asked what Stephen could possibly offer, and Stephen said he wanted Dormammu to leave Earth alone, to take his zealots and never return. And Dormammu laughed and killed Stephen, destroyed him instantly with a blast of energy, and Stephen died, felt himself dying. But then time reversed and he was alive again, was back in front of Dormammu making the same offer, because Stephen had activated the time stone before entering the dark dimension, had created a time loop that would reset every time he died, trapping himself and Dormammu in endless repetition, and Dormammu killed him again, and Stephen came back and made his bargain again, and Dormammu killed him again, crushed him, burned him, tore him apart, killed Stephen Strange in hundreds of different terrible ways, and each time Stephen came back and said the same words, "Dormammu, I've come to bargain," and Dormammu raged and killed him again and again, and Stephen died thousands of times, millions of times, experienced death over and over in an endless loop, and the pain was unimaginable. The psychological torture of dying repeatedly while remaining conscious and aware, and Stephen could have stopped it at any time, could have released the time loop, and he escaped. But he didn't. He endured. He kept coming back, kept making his bargain, because this was the only way, the only strategy that could work against a being as powerful as Dormammu. And Dormammu couldn't escape the loop, couldn't break free, was trapped by time even though he existed beyond it, and the entity who had absorbed countless dimensions was being tortured by repetition, was being driven mad by the same moment happening over and over, and finally, Dormammu broke, agreed to Stephen's terms just to escape the loop, agreed to take Caecilius and his zealots into the dark dimension and leave Earth forever, and Stephen released the time loop, and Dormammu kept his word, dragged the screaming Caecilius and his followers into the dark dimension. And Earth was saved, the sanctums were restored through the time reversal, and Stephen Strange had defeated a god by being willing to die forever, by accepting infinite death to protect a world that didn't even know it had been in danger. And this was the ultimate proof that Stephen had changed. That the selfish surgeon, who'd cared only about his own glory, had become a true hero who would sacrifice everything for others. After the battle with Dormammu, after saving the world through surrender and sacrifice rather than through control and power, Stephen was offered the position of protector of the New York Sanctum. And essentially this made him the Sorcerer Supreme, even if the title wasn't officially his yet, made him responsible for defending Earth from mystical threats. And this was a far cry from his old life. It's a surgeon, but Stephen accepted, understood now, that this was his purpose, that his gifts were meant to serve something larger than his own ego, and he took up residence in the Sanctum Sanctorum on Bleecker Street in Greenwich Village. This building that looked like an ordinary brownstone from the outside, but contained infinite rooms and magical artifacts inside. And he had the Cloak of Levitation, this sentient magical artifact that had chosen him during the fight with Caecilius. And the cloak was more than just a tool, was almost a companion, had a personality, and would help Stephen or sometimes argue with him by refusing to do what he wanted. And Stephen found this amusing and frustrating in equal measure, and he had the Eye of Agamotto containing the Time Stone, one of the 6 Infinity Stones, and this made him a target, made him responsible for one of the most powerful objects in the universe. And Wong stayed at the Sanctum, became Stephen's friend and advisor, and the person who would call him out when his old arrogance started showing. And together they protected Earth, monitored mystical threats, dealt with beings from other dimensions who tried to invade. And Stephen studied constantly, read ancient texts, learned spells and techniques from thousands of years of magical tradition, and he was building a new life, a life of purpose and meaning that his old existence as a surgeon had never provided. And his hands still shook, still bore the scars from the accident, still couldn't hold a scalpel steady. But he didn't mourn this anymore, didn't wish for his old life back, because he'd found something greater, had discovered that there were more ways to help people than surgery, that protecting reality itself was perhaps the most important service anyone could perform, and he was content with this, was at peace in a way he'd never been when he was famous Dr. Strange, the neurosurgeon. Stephen's role as protector expanded beyond just mystical threats when he encountered Thor, the Asgardian god of thunder, who came to Earth searching for his father Odin. And Thor had heard of the sorcerers who protected Earth and sought out the New York Sanctum. And Stephen, who maintained a watch list of beings who could threaten the planet, had Thor and his brother Loki on that list. And when they appeared, Stephen brought them to the Sanctum and offered to help locate Odin. But only if Thor agreed to take Loki and leave Earth immediately after finding him, because Loki had invaded New York with an alien army, and Stephen didn't trust him. And Thor agreed, and Stephen used his magic to locate Odin in Norway. And this interaction was Stephen's introduction to the larger cosmic universe, to aliens and gods and threats that went beyond mystical dimensions. And he realized that protecting Earth meant being aware of everything, not just magical threats, but also extraterrestrial ones. And he began monitoring cosmic activities, watching for signs of invasion or danger. And this expanded awareness would prove crucial when Thanos began his quest for the Infinity Stones, when the mad Titan who'd been manipulating events from the shadows for years finally made his move, and Earth became a battleground for the fate of the universe, and Stephen Strange, who'd been protecting reality from mystical threats, would have to face a threat that was physical and cosmic and utterly beyond anything he'd prepared for. The day Thanos' forces arrived in New York started like any other day, Steph. On was at the sanctum with Wong. They were discussing a mystical anomaly in Central Park, something minor that needed investigation. When they felt it, this massive disturbance in the fabric of space, and they went outside to see a giant Q-ship, this donut-shaped spacecraft, descending over the city. And Stephen knew immediately this was serious. This was the kind of threat that required all of Earth's defenders. And moments later, Bruce Banner crashed through the ceiling of the sanctum, sent by Heimdall from the Asgardian refugee ship that Thanos had attacked. And Bruce warned them that Thanos was coming for the Infinity Stones, that he'd already collected some of them and was hunting the rest. And Stephen had the Time Stone, which meant he was a target, and they needed to contact Tony Stark, needed to assemble Earth's heroes, and Stephen reluctantly agreed to seek out Stark, and they found him in the park with Pepper Potts. And Stephen introduced himself, and immediately he and Tony clashed, two geniuses with massive egos who saw reflections of their own worst traits in each other. Stephen saw Tony's arrogance and need for control, and Tony saw Stephen's condescension and superiority complex. And they didn't like each other at all, but didn't have time to argue because the Black Order arrived, Thanos' servants who'd come to take the Time Stone, and Ebony Maw and Cull Obsidian attacked. And the battle began in the streets of New York, and Stephen fought Ebony Maw, this powerful sorcerer who could manipulate matter, who could turn the environment into weapons. And Stephen used every trick he knew, created shields and portals, used the crimson bands and the winds of Watum. But Ma was incredibly powerful, had centuries of experience, and he managed to capture Stephen, used his telekinesis to bind Stephen and steal the Eye of Agamotto, and he took Stephen onto the Q-ship as it left Earth, heading for Thanos' location. And Stephen was trapped, was being taken to Thanos, who would torture him for the Time Stone, and he should have been terrified, but part of him was already planning, already thinking about what came next, because he knew this was important, knew that how he handled this situation would determine the fate of the universe. Tony Stark and Peter Parker stowed away on the Q-ship, came to rescue Stephen even though he hadn't asked for rescue, and together they managed to kill Ebony Maw by blasting a hole in the ship's hull and ejecting him into space. And they freed Stephen, and he was grateful but also annoyed because he'd been working on his own escape plan, and now they were stuck on this ship heading to Titan with no way to turn it around. And Tony wanted to go home, wanted to turn around and go back to Earth. But Stephen made a decision, said they should go forward, should ambush Thanos on Titan when he arrived, should try to take the fight to him rather than waiting for him to come to Earth. And this was strategic thinking, was Stephen using his tactical mind, but it was also arrogant, was Stephen believing they could defeat a Titan with 4 Infinity Stones through clever planning, and Tony pointed out how insane this was, and they argued, and Peter tried to mediate, and eventually Tony agreed because what choice did they have? They couldn't turn the ship around, and going back to Earth would just lead Thanos there. So forward was the only option, and they flew to Titan, this desolate planet that had once been beautiful before Thanos destroyed it, and they prepared for the battle that would determine everything. On Titan, they encountered the Guardians of the Galaxy, Star-Lord and Drax and Mantis and Nebula, this team of cosmic heroes who were also trying to stop Thanos. And after a brief fight caused by mutual suspicion, they joined forces, and together they planned an ambush. And before they executed it, before they committed to this desperate plan, Stephen did something that would haunt him forever. He used the time stone to look forward, to see the possible futures, to look at every possible outcome of the coming battle, and he sat there for what seemed like minutes, but was actually much longer in the time-accelerated state the time stone created, and he looked through 40,605 possible futures, watched the battle play out in millions of different ways, saw the Avengers try every possible strategy, every possible approach, and in almost every future they lost. Thanos won, got all the stones, snapped his fingers, killed half the universe, and Stephen watched this happen again and again. Watched his friends die, watched the universe fall, watched everything he cared about turn to dust. And he kept searching, kept looking, desperate to find a path to victory. And finally, in one future out of 14 million, he saw them win. Saw a path where Thanos was defeated, where the snap was undone, where the universe was saved, but the path was narrow, required specific events to happen in a specific order, required people to make certain choices at certain moments, and it required terrible sacrifices, required people Stephen cared about to die, and Stephen saw what he would have to do, saw the choice he would have to make, and it destroyed him inside. But he accepted it, because one future out of 14 million was better than zero, and when he came back from the vision, when Tony asked how many futures they won, Stephen held up one finger and said 1, and he carried the knowledge of what had to happen alone, couldn't share it, because explaining might change things, might tip them into one of the losing timelines, and he had to make sure everything happened exactly as he'd seen it, even when it meant watching people suffer, even when it meant making choices that seemed wrong. The battle on Titan went exactly as Stephen had foreseen. They ambushed Thanos when he arrived, used Mantis's powers to put him to sleep, worked together to restrain him, and they nearly got the gauntlet off, were seconds from victory. But then Star-Lord learned that Thanos had killed Gamora, the woman he loved, had thrown her off a cliff to get the Soul Stone. And Quill lost control, attacked Thanos in grief and rage, broke the restraints, and Thanos woke up and fought back, and he defeated them one by one, used the Infinity Stones to counter their attacks, and Stephen fought him, used every spell and technique he knew, created multiple duplicates of himself, turned the debris from Titan's dead moon into a storm of projectiles, but Thanos countered everything, was too powerful, had 4 Infinity Stones and knew how to use them, and he defeated Stephen, and then he went after Tony, and Tony fought desperately, used his nanotech armor to create weapons and shields, and he managed to wound Thanos, drew a single drop of blood, and Thanos respected this, said all that for a drop of blood. And then he stabbed Tony, drove a blade, made from Tony's own nanotech, into his abdomen, and Tony was dying. And Stephen watched this happen and knew this was the moment. This was where he had to make the choice he'd seen in the vision. And he called out to Thanos, said he'd trade the time stone for Tony's life, and Tony told him not to, reminded him they'd agreed not to trade lives, that protecting the stones was more important than any individual. But Stephen had seen the future, Tony had to survive this moment for the one winning timeline to happen, and he gave Thanos the Time Stone, surrendered one of the most powerful objects in the universe to the Mad Titan, and Thanos took it and went to Earth to get the Mind Stone from Vision. And Tony demanded to know why Stephen had done that, why he'd given up, and Stephen said, "We're in the end game now," said there was no other way. This was the one timeline where they won, and Tony didn't understand, couldn't see how giving Thanos 4 stones could possibly lead to victory, could only see that they'd failed. And then Thanos completed the gauntlet on Earth, got all 6 stones, snapped his fingers, and half of all life in the universe turned to dust. And on Titan, people started disappearing. Mantis and Drax and Star-Lord and Strange all turning to ash. And Stephen's last words as he disintegrated were, "Tony, there was no other way," and he was gone. And Tony was left alone on an alien planet, surrounded by dust, having watched this arrogant sorcerer give Thanos the Time Stone and then disappear. And Tony didn't understand, couldn't see the plan, could only see failure and loss and the end.